it's a great honor to be here at the Hoboken Museum. Every time I've had a new book, I've always launched it right here because this is such a welcoming, cordial environment. And I'm very proud to have another book coming out. And this is the second edition of the New Jersey Turnpike book. But I want to first give you the background on how it all got started. It was back in 1987 when Michael Rockland and I decided to write this book about the New Jersey Turnpike. And our colleagues at Rutgers thought we were crazy. He said, why would anybody write a book about the Turnpike? Who would read it? And it would probably be the most boring and ignored book in history. Well, the book came out 2 years later in 1989. The New York Times gave it a good review. Not too many academic books get reviewed in the New York Times. And then we were amazed. It started to sell very quickly. We didn't quite understand it. People had positive views about the Turnpike. More people had negative views about the Turnpike. But either way, they were interested in the topic. And all was going well. And then something amazing happened. The New Jersey State Library came out with a list. And this was called the 10 best books that have ever been written by a New Jerseyan or about New Jersey. And this list included Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, F. Scott Fitzgerald, This Side of Paradise, John McPhee, The Pine Barrens, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. Now, of course, we were pleased, but we were very puzzled. How did we get in this list? And kind of what we figured, they must have had 9 big hits, and they were desperate for a 10th. And so they came up with our book. We figured they were just desperate. But anyway, along came the hardback edition, 1989, and it sold out pretty quickly. And the Rutgers Press, they issued a paperback edition, and that sold out. And eventually, there was a lot of interest. We appeared on Good Morning America, and the press issued a second paperback edition. And by 2 years ago, in 2022, even the second paperback edition had been sold out. And so this was the motivation for the press to say, okay, we'll do a second edition of the book because so much has happened since 1989. And normally, academic books are very short-lived. And this one, for some reason, appealed to a larger audience. Normally, for an academic book, people say even one's own mother is not going to read the thing. But the widespread appeal of this book was unusual, but for that I'm very grateful. And now I just want to give you a little bit of background on it. This is the original edition. It was published in 1989. And this is your typical Welcome to the Turnpike entrance sign. And the whole thing is, it was started in 1949, and it was kind of a crash project. It was absolutely straight. It was a lot of the engineers, they had been involved in the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, and they were used to working under urgency. And this was very urgent. It must be done by November 51, 118 miles straight as an arrow. So here's the construction, and they did it in less than 2 years. And at the time, there's no environmental impact statement. Just get out of the way. We're coming through. We're going to build this thing. And if you have a house, here's our offer. You better take it, because tomorrow we're going to knock it down. I mean, there was no negotiating. This was an urgent project. You recognize this, the Hackensack River Bridge. There's a lot of construction. And here is Mr. First. He was there hours and hours before. He was the first one to pay the toll. And as a courtesy, the toll collector stepped out of the booth to make the exchange. Well, it was very interesting. They had a long discussion about how they were going to patrol this thing, and they finally decided they would have their own New Jersey State Trooper, Troop E, and this was kind of unique because it was to be paid out of the toll money, and it was a whole new division of the state troopers, and this was one of their early goodwill gestures, rounding up the stray cattle to get them out of the way of the road. And this was a goodwill gesture when they were going through the southern part of the state, through the farmlands. Sometimes the turnpike would cut through a farm, and it would cut off the eastern part of the pasture from the western part of the pasture. And of course, you can't have cattle crossing the turnpike. So what they did was they built these tunnels to allow the cattle to pass. This was kind of a courtesy to the farmers. They weren't always courteous, but they did take care of the farmers. So here's Troop E. They're on the ball trying to make sure all the trucks pass inspection. And here's a state trooper, because at first people didn't know how to cope with going through the toll booth and surrendering a ticket and paying for their money. Well, there have been some spectacular accidents. This is kind of hard to believe, but I talked to the firm Guaranteed Motor Towing from New Brunswick. What happened back in the early 1980s, this tractor trailer collided with a car, riding on top of the car, apparently crushing it. And yet, miraculously, the people survived this crash. I don't think any of us remember this, but in the early 1950s, when they were introducing the whole concept of the toll road, in the service areas, they were staffed with piquettes who served as hostesses. They would give treats to the kids, they would hand maps to the motorists, and they were just kind of a welcoming staff. Well, even then, the traffic was heavy. Here's the Eastern Spur, New York City in the background. And one of the things that Michael Rockland and I grappled with in the book was the whole thing about, is the turnpike ugly or is it beautiful? And we found this photographer, Stephen Siegel, who had a way of finding architectural features of the turnpike that actually it's kind of beautiful. Even though the common view is that the turnpike is ugly. You see what I'm saying? It all depends on your point of view. Is this an industrial wasteland or is this a beautiful roadway? And we try to give both sides of the story in the book. I think this is really quite beautiful in its own way. Well, this is getting towards the end of the turnpike. And here's the split. We're all familiar with this. You can turn off to the Lincoln Tunnel or you can continue on to the George Washington Bridge. Well, Here's the familiar logo. And this is really interesting. More on this in a moment. These two roads, they're so different. The New Jersey Turnpike, it's straight, it's all business all the time, it's through an industrial area. The Garden State Parkway, it's deliberately designed to be beautiful with foliage and trees and landscaping. More on that in a moment. They've since been absorbed. Well, how much did it cost? Construction began in January 1950, took 25 months to construct it. $225 million. Sounds kind of reasonable by today's standards. Here's the brand new turnpike in 1951. Construction during the 50s. This was an urgent project. A lot of these people had, as I said, participated in the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. This was done with considerable urgency. There was a debate at the beginning, should it be concrete or should it be asphalt? In the end, they decided on asphalt. So eventually what happened, and this is, I think, part of the popularity of the book, is it caught on in popular culture. And this is where we got the title of our book, Looking for America on the New Jersey Turnpike. Kathy, I'm lost, I said, though I knew she was sleeping. I'm empty and aching, I don't know why, counting the cars on the New Jersey Turnpike. They've all come to look for America, all come to look for America, all come to look for America.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it ugly or is it beautiful? Well, I think the side of the argument where people say it's ugly, they're looking at the industrialization, such as the Bayway refinery, converting crude oil into gasoline. Or the busyness of the Newark Liberty International Airport. Well, Governor Driscoll, he was the one who really pushed for both the New Jersey Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway. Of course, he had to win the acceptance of the legislature, but I think historians generally give Alfred Driscoll the credit for pushing through these two projects. Now, if Driscoll was the governor, Paul Wyman Trost, he was the chairperson. And he was the one pushing, it's got to be done in 2 years. We've got to alleviate the congestion. I think, here's what happened. This was completed in 1951, and think about it. Why was it so important in New Jersey? Because New Jersey was the most densely populated state. New Jersey was suffering from vehicular congestion, and it was an urgent project. Now, think about it. The interstate highway, that came along 5 years later in 1956, thanks to President Dwight Eisenhower. And when the designers of the Interstate Highway Commission sat down to do the paperwork, decide the design criteria, where did they go to get? They went to the turnpike to figure out the specifications. And indeed, I don't want to get too technical here, but the specifications for the turnpike are just a little bit more rigorous than the specifications for the Interstate Highway Commission in terms of the angle of the roads and the turn, or the widths of the lanes and the widths of the shoulders. Well, Opened to the public, November 1951. This was when it was still under construction. And originally, of course, some of us remember this, when you got on, you got a ticket, and when you got off, you surrendered the ticket and paid your toll. This was the original New Jersey Turnpike building in East Brunswick, New Jersey. But it's since been replaced because it wasn't big enough when the Turnpike absorbed the Garden State Parkway. And so now this building has been largely abandoned and the parking area is used for surplus vehicles. This is real interesting. The northbound view passing under the Pulaski Skyway going over the river. What happened here was if you're going to build a bridge over the Passaic River, you have to make it high enough so ships can pass underneath. So the trick was, yeah, the bridge has to be high, but it has to start low because you've got to pass underneath the Pulaski Skyway. And as a result, this is the steepest incline on the whole turnpike because it really exceeds the specifications for inclines. You're not supposed to have such a steep incline, but this is the steepest incline because the ships have to pass underneath on the river. In my book, I spent a lot of time with the Guaranteed Motor Towing Service, which served the portion of the turnpike closest to my home in East Brunswick. Basically, the way it works is that there are about a dozen different authorized towing companies, each one of which has a sector on the turnpike. And one of the big controversies, which we cover in the book, is a lot of people didn't know the procedure. They just assumed they could phone AAA. Doesn't work that way. AAA isn't authorized on the turnpike. You got to deal with the turnpike tow people. And people would say to me, I didn't know that. How am I supposed to know that? You got to read the ticket. Who the hell's going to read the ticket? You're driving. But in the fine print on the ticket, it says if you have a disabled vehicle, you should stay with the vehicle, wait for the trooper to arrive, and the trooper will call the appropriate tow company. It's still that way today, but a lot of people don't know the system. It's controversial, but what the turnpike says is we can't have AAA. That's not sufficient. We need these heavy duty trucks because a lot of the breakdowns are 18-wheelers. Law enforcement. Well, it's part of the state trooper, state police, but it's all paid for out of turnpike revenues. It's kind of a very specialized setup. One of their big responsibilities is interdicting drugs because, of course, the drugs originate from the south and they come north along the turnpike. This is another one of the authorized tow company. Look at the size of that. I mean, that's much, much bigger than the typical AAA, which you can call a car. This tow truck can haul anything. Okay, more popular culture. Bruce Springsteen's song, State Trooper. License registration, I ain't got none, but I got a clear conscience about the things I've done. Mr. State Trooper, please don't stop me. Good luck on that. Joseph Concord, poet. I like Jersey best. I've seen a lot of places, seen pictures of the rest, but all the places I could think of, I like Jersey best. Dan Fogarty, the New Jersey Turnpike Blues. The cotton-picking, ever-loving New Jersey Turnpike Blues. It entered popular culture. Even Chuck Berry, You Can't Catch Me. Now, you can't catch me, baby, you can't catch me, because if you get too close, you know I'm going like a cool breeze. I like this last few stints. I put my foot in my tank and I began to roll. Morning siren, it was a state patrol. So I let up my wings and I blew my horn. Bye-bye, New Jersey, I've become airborne. The Midnight Cowboy. Well, this best-selling movie, it has any number of views of Manhattan as seen from the turnpike.
Ah, yes.
This one,
Yeah.
I think we all know this one. You remember the opening scenes, he's emerging from the Lincoln Tunnel.
And just ticking.
Yeah.
While he's smoking a cigar.
Yes. There he is. Exiting the Lincoln Tunnel. Looking out the window, he sees the Manhattan skyline. Well, it's so popular that there's all kinds of, we're the capital of society. People cash in on that. What they did is every year they would honor a different exit. Back in the 1950s, when this road was designed, it was designed by these engineers from World War II. We're just going to make this thing straight. Interestingly enough, now highway engineers say this isn't necessarily the best way to build a road because it kind of induces a soporific state. It's just going straight, mile after mile, almost puts you to sleep. We now know, even if it's not necessary, it's probably good to put in a few curves to keep the driver awake. We didn't know that back then. Whenever I have out-of-state guests and they know I've written about the turnpike, they often want to get a tour. And this is one of the highlights where you have the New Jersey Turnpike, the Garden State Parkway, and Route 9 all intersecting. I call this the triple bypass, triple overpass, if you will. This is a conspicuous landmark. Well, interestingly enough, all the rest areas are named for significant figures from New Jersey history. But one of the things that Michael Rockland and I discussed in the book is they don't do a particularly good job of explaining who these people are. You just go in, and in fact, what happened is my colleague, Michael Rockland, he spent 24 hours in the Joyce Kilmer rest area.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and he interviewed just about everybody who came through. And he took statistics, and I think of the 72 people that he interviewed, only two knew who had an idea who Joyce Kilmer was. And we put that in the first edition of the book. Since then, the Turnpike now puts a picture and a plaque in the vestibule. So, okay, you go in the front door and you go through the vestibule, you go to the next door. You're gonna stop and look at the picture because people are coming and going.
Right.
In other words, it's not a museum, it's just, they did put the thing in the vestibule as a result of our book, but there's still a lot more could be done to honor the honoree. Because most people don't even know who it is that's being honored. Here's the Molly Pitcher. Who was Molly Pitcher? Oh, I don't know. Well, we now know that she's a legendary hero of the Revolutionary War because she brought water to her husband who was firing the cannons against the British. And when her husband fell, she took over firing the cannons. There's the legend. Take a look.
She's dressed quite nicely.
It's a bit of a legend because we never, there was more than one woman who was bringing water
Right.
to the soldiers. So, and there's no such thing as last name Pitcher.
Right.
It's a collective, it's a legend, it's a story. But Joyce Kilmer. Who was Joyce Kilmer? Oh. Well, that's another place that my colleague investigated. Oh, I don't remember who she was. Wait a minute, it's a guy. Alfred Joyce Kilmer.
His grandson was here.
He's best known for the poem Trees. That's his birthplace in New Brunswick. Well, this was one of the big changes since 1989 to the present time. Most all of the rest areas have been renovated. And this is a conspicuous one that's been renovated. Wow, look at the difference. It's a football coach.
Right.
We can catch excellence. Well, he went on to be famous in the big leagues, but he got his start in Inglewood. So that's the New Jersey connection. And the Turnpike's been on the ball with dealing with the new electrification. This is another one. Is it ugly or is it beautiful? It all depends on your point of view. Well, it certainly is industrial. These are recognizable landmarks. Going south, this will be on your right after the airport. You see the power transmission lines. This is an industrial area. But as you go further south, it becomes more rural and with fewer lanes. And this was recent. The last exit going southbound, you have this tribute to coastal New Jersey with a kind of pseudo lighthouse. If you keep going, you leave New Jersey and you cross the Delaware Memorial Bridge. Okay, so that is pretty much what we wrote first time around. Now, here's our excuse for today's meeting. We have a second edition, and I just want to tell you a little bit about what happened with the second edition. We didn't make any changes in the original thing. We added some photos, but we didn't make any changes. But we did write about 30 or 40 pages covering what's happened since 1989. And I'll just hit some of the highlights here. There are 4 big changes that took place. The merger between the New Jersey Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway. Most people don't even know about this. But what happened was, briefly, the Garden State Parkway was not making much money, and they had a lot of need for repairs, such as replacing out-of-date bridges. Meanwhile, the New Jersey Turnpike was raking in the money hand over fist. And so the governor and the state legislature decided, we're going to transfer the money, some of the money from the Turnpike to the Garden State Parkway. We're going to have a merger between the Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway. Well, I got to tell you, it wasn't really a merger. The Turnpike took over the Garden State Parkway. That's not a merger, that's a takeover. Well, but I'm giving you the short version here. The Turnpike executives, they were very clever. They weren't nasty about it. They allowed the Garden State Parkway to keep their logo on their signage and their vehicles, such that even today, most New Jerseyans don't know that the Garden State Parkway is being managed through the Turnpike Authority. The second big change was the introduction of Easy Pass. Now, that was necessitated in large part because of the congestion at the toll booths. There were too many rear-end collisions at the toll booths. This was necessary. It wasn't easy. In part, it wasn't easy because it was a job killer. What about the toll collectors? But the Turnpike was very clever about this because what they decided to do was they made a deal with the toll collectors. Y'all can keep your job, keep your pay, keep your pension, work till you retire. We're not going to kick you out. We're not going to make you lose your job. However, we're not hiring any new toll collectors. That was the collective deal, which was pretty much agreed on as being fair. They allowed the people to keep their job. In contrast with, you know as well as me, we no longer have elevator operators. You go to the grocery store, it's self-checkout so many places. A lot of people have lost their jobs through automation, but that didn't happen here at the Turnpike. Number 3 was the widening between 6 and 9. It's funny, I have family in Richmond, Virginia, so I was quite used to driving the Turnpike southbound. And if you've driven southbound, you know what I'm talking about. Between exit 9 and exit 6, there was a constriction because what happened was there were 5 lanes that were congested into 3 lanes because there were 2 truck lanes and 3 car lanes became 3 everybody lanes. It was unbelievably congested, and that became an urgent need to widen the road. The 4th thing was the service area renovations. Basically, that happened because it all started with the Grover Cleveland rest area. Because you remember Hurricane Sandy back in 2012. Yeah, what happened, and nobody really knew about this, there was a creek behind the Grover Cleveland rest area. And when the hurricane came along, nobody had ever paid any attention to this creek, but the creek flooded and virtually destroyed the existing Lover Cleveland rest area, which needed to be replaced. And the architect who did it, Lee Amaro, he did such a good job that it was kind of a wake-up call to the Turnpike Authority. Maybe we should renovate nearly all of these rest areas. So that's basically what happened in the second edition, but let me show you here. The Turnpike and the Parkway, these were merged under the authority of Governor McGreevey back in 2003. Here is Governor McGreevey signing the legislation, May 27th, 2003, for the takeover. Easy Pass launched in the year 2000. I have to tell you, it did not go smoothly. There were lots of problems. Some people were getting away without paying at all. Other people who paid were getting tickets. It was so complicated. Why was it complicated? You got to think about it for a minute. You know, if there's a toll for a bridge or a toll for a tunnel, it's one cost, one way. But the Turnpike had so many entrances and so many exits, it got very complicated very quickly, and initially they were overwhelmed. It took a long time to debug it. I think we all appreciate the change. We go through a lot faster these days. Here's the widening project, which I just described between 6 and 9. This was really a big project because, you know, if you're widening the road, you got to buy the houses of the people who are adjacent to it, and you got to deal with the complaints of other houses that are nearby because there's too much noise. There are a lot of problems. I love this slide because you can see what they had to do. You see the inner part, the existing traffic was allowed to continue while the widening took place on the margins. Of course, this was interesting. A lot of people had houses along where the thing was being widened were complaining about the noise. So I spent a lot of time interviewing John Keller, who was the senior engineer on the project. And his instructions to his subordinates was, anybody who's legitimately disturbed by the noise of the Turnpike, we should build a sound barrier, even though it's very expensive. However, just because somebody wants a sound barrier doesn't necessarily mean they're entitled to it. We do a scientific test of the amount of sound. This is the new Grover Cleveland service area. And I talked to Lee Amaro. He had never done a service area before. How many architects get called into a service area? But he wanted to come up with something that was inspiring and inviting. And it almost looks like an airplane ready to take off. It has that curtain wall of glass. And that kind of glass is very expensive. And he had a limited budget. So what he had to do was, in order to afford that wonderful facade, the curtain wall of glass, he had to cut corners elsewhere. So when you go in and you look up at the ceiling is unfinished. But I think that's a worthwhile trade-off. He did a very good job, and he did such a good job that this sort of kicked off the motivation to restore nearly all of the service areas on both the Garden State Parkway and the Turnpike. So that's the end of this formal presentation, and I want to apologize for being late. The traffic was horrendous, and we're behind a broken down vehicle, but we do have a few minutes. Questions, comments?
Let's do an applause. I wanted to say that one of my favorite parts of the first edition, I haven't seen the second, is the humor that was used. So I guess when Rockland went into the Molly Pitcher rest area, he'd go to the cookie concession and go, "What time does Molly Pitcher come into work?" Or, "Who is Molly Pitcher?" And they would just say, "Oh, she comes in at 5." It was really like they didn't have a clue.
You hit on something very important here, is when two people write a book, it's not half the work, it's not twice as much work. Because we often disagree on what to do. But in the end, I think it came out much better, and I can tell you why. So this isn't in the book, but this is the true story, is I think I'm very good with the technical details. I interview the engineers about the widening. I interview the architect about the construction of the new rest areas. But Michael Rockland, he's more of a novelist. He's more of a storyteller. And so what you have in the book, I would argue, is a blend of technical accuracy with enjoyable storytelling. So, and I think both of us, we like to avoid academic jargon. So I think we use everyday language. It's a readable book. And the other thing I have to say, in deference to my senior colleague, Michael Rockland, was when we first started this book, we met once a month, and we each had a quota of so many words to write. And he would write his, I would write mine, we would meet once a month. But after the first couple of months, I hate to admit it, but I started falling behind with my quota. It was very embarrassing. And Michael Rockland, my senior colleague, sat me down. He said, "Look, Angus, you don't know everything about the turnpike. I don't know everything about the turnpike. Nobody knows everything about the turnpike. Just tell them what you do know." That was the best writing advice I ever got. Just go ahead and write it. And that got me going again. So it was a good partnership.
When was the Turnpike first conceived?
I believe it was 1948, 1949.
That was,
And here, that's a very good question. Why? Because during World War II, American industry was making tanks and airplanes, cannons.
right.
They were not making automobiles so much. And then 1945, when peace comes, the automobile industry explodes. More and more people have cars. New Jersey's the most densely populated state. The roads were clogged. And it felt urgent that we had to do something, way ahead of any other state. Any other comment?
Can you talk a little bit about state troopers and their reputation? They're always getting flagged for being discriminatory of who they pull over. And I know you're taking the turnpike home, so be careful how you answer.
It was funny in writing the book because I came from a military family. My grandfather, my father, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, they were all military officers. And so I was kind of sympathetic with the problems that the police have. Michael Rockland, on the other hand, he's your classic college professor liberal who sees everything that the police do wrong. And so we went back and forth. Like I was talking about the police helping with the cattle on the roadway. But he had, and it's in the book, there was a case, let's see if I can explain it. There was an accident on the turnpike, and there was a a police car saw the accident, but it was going very fast. And so he passed the accident, but then he was backing up to survey the accident. But, you know, when you back up, you don't have good control of your car backing up fast. And he caused a second accident. The cop backing up, he caused an accident. And then there was a guy from Virginia who was a professional photographer, and he started recording what this cop had done. Well, he was arrested. He was put in the Turnpike jail. This was not right. He was documenting what the cop had done wrong, but he used a technical. You're not supposed to take photos on the Turnpike.
Like Russia.
So I think that's perhaps, and there are other faults that the police have made, but that's a pretty conspicuous one, and it's in the book. So yeah, we try to balance the criticism and the praise. Oh, in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love your upbeat delivery on the lecture, and I'm so glad you got here.
Thank you, Lord. There were times I thought we weren't going to make it at all.
You said you come from a military background. Have you always loved cars, and you played with trucks growing up, and dump trucks and things like that? Where does your love for this subject come from?
Great question.
Well, no, because these were naval officers. I was always fond of ships, so that wasn't how it happened. However, what really happened was I had grown up largely in rural Virginia, where we had, if we were lucky, 2-lane asphalt roads. Most of them were dirt roads. And so when I had the good fortune after grad school to land a job at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, exit 9 on the Turnpike.
Right.
I'm looking at the Turnpike, and I'm like, holy cow, divided highways, multiple lanes. This is crazy, this is so big. I think the fact that I came from out of state, I noticed it, because I think most New Jerseyans just take the road for granted. And that was sort of how I got initially interested. But I have to also tell you a little story. It was in 1985 that I first wrote the proposal for the Turnpike book, 1985. But then I forgot, I had requested a Fulbright fellowship to study for a year in the Philippines. So I went away 85, 86 in the Philippines, and I sort of forgot about the Turnpike book proposal. Meanwhile, the press was getting annoyed because they hadn't heard from me. I wasn't even thinking about it, but they complained to Michael Rockland, who was the chairman of the American Studies Department. What's with Gillespie? He said he would write this book. We haven't heard a thing. And so when I got back from the Philippines in the summer of 1986, he sat me down and he said, they're really annoyed with you because you haven't done anything. You got to write this book in a hurry. He said, oh, I have so much to do. I just got back. He said, well, maybe I can help you. Maybe we can co-write the book. And that was kind of a savior for me, because the reason I later learned that he offered to co-write the book was that he was writing a novel because he's a storyteller. But he had hit a writer's block, and he thought if he could jump over and do nonfiction, he could get going again with the novel. And so it did me a big favor because it got me going on the book. So that's kind of the origin story.
Well, why were they supposed to discontinue the tolls at one point?
I'm sorry?
The tolls, why were they supposed to discontinue charging the tolls?
Oh, initially there was some talk of, we'll collect the tolls until the road is paid for. But
Please.
That didn't stick.
Mm.
That was too comfortable.
Right.
Mm.
The Triborough Bridge is the one where, Moses, said that, oh yeah, it's gonna pay, but it kept going and going. Matter of fact, the setup was designed that when you dropped the dime, it went right to the building where it's counted.
Did you have something?
Yeah, sorry, is there anywhere significant to you along the turnpike, like personally?
I didn't get.
Is there anywhere like that's really significant to you along the turnpike when you were doing your research?
You have a favorite spot on the
Yeah.
turnpike?
What's my favorite spot?
Or not?
I took a break.
I think my favorite spot is the Grover Cleveland rest area. Because I spent so much time with the architect, I kind of know all the details of why he succeeded.
Is the turnpike the most traveled road in the world?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I mean, I've heard that story, that it's
Yeah.
the most.
I would have to Google that. I'm not sure they have the data on that. It is true, the Pennsylvania Turnpike pre-existed the New Jersey Turnpike. But there's a huge difference between those two roads, because the Pennsylvania Turnpike basically took over an abandoned railroad. So it wasn't designed as a road from scratch, it was designed as a railroad from scratch. And it's been constantly widened and fixed.
I must say the rest stops now and like the Grover Cleveland one you mentioned, they're phenomenal. I mean, it was such an upgrade and the food is so much better. It's a lot more expensive, but in the old days, it would be Stewart sandwiches that had been like sitting around forever. And now it's Shake Shack and, it's upscale. It's incredible.
Yeah. Looking at that glass facade is a lot more inspiring than walking into a hollow door.
Sure. And what I like about all your books is you kind of pick a system, whether it be Turnpike or the World Trade Center or containerization, and you just really stick to it and get into the nitty gritty.
Yes. I think I got my start when I first graduated from college. I majored in American Studies, which is liberal arts, but my very first job out of college, I became a technical editor for General Dynamics Electric Boat. That's in Groton, Connecticut. They make atomic submarines.
Right.
And so my friends all said, what the hell? You majored in American Studies and you're a technical editor at General Dynamics Electric Boat? I said, well, yeah. What you have to understand, with every atomic submarine comes a book of directions.
Right.
So I would interview the engineers to try to explain it so that the naval officers could understand it.
Right.
And so that sort of got me started with these engineering projects. But again, I owe a lot to Hoboken Museum because every single book I've launched here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are we selling some books?
Yeah, I'm gonna sell it at my cost.
That's very generous.
Which is $20. I'm not looking for money, I'm looking for readers.
Cool. I'm gonna turn some lights on, we have some refreshments, you want to ask a question, and I guess Angus, I see Michael has signed the book, so you need to sign.
Yeah.